Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Chupka. I'm the Vice President for Research and Programs here at the Energy Storage Association. Thank you for attending today's webinar on FERC Order 2222, Implications for Storage Aggregations, the Grid, and Resilience. This webinar is being recorded. Everyone who registered will also receive a link to the recording and slides within the next couple of days. Questions can be submitted at any time throughout the webinar via the question chat box in your browser, and we'll get to those after our speakers finish their presentations. In the text of your question, please indicate to whom you would like your question addressed. All meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our antitrust guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members area of the ESA website. If you're not yet an ESA member and would like more information, you can reach out to my colleague, Brenda Lovell. Membership includes free access to all of our webinars, including many that are exclusively for members, among numerous other benefits. So please contact Brenda for more information. Before we begin, I'd like to announce a related upcoming ESA event. ESA will host an in-depth seminar on planning and energy storage on December 2 and 3, with a detail on agenda and registration available tomorrow. Please check our website for additional information. Today we are going to explore the implications of the recent FERC Order 2222, which will enable distributed energy resources such as energy storage to participate in bulk power markets. We will examine Order 2222 from a variety of perspectives: how RTO and ISOs will implement the order, how aggregators might assemble portfolios of distributed assets into virtual power plants, and how distribution utilities will manage the retail-wholesale interface. I'm delighted to introduce an excellent panel for today's discussion. First up will be Mike Berlinski, Director of Emerging Technology at Customized Energy Solutions. Mike will describe the essential provisions of Order 2222 and how the RTOs and ISOs will respond to their filings next year. Ted Coe will be next. He's Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at STEM Incorporated. Ted will describe how the order will expand opportunities for aggregators of distributed energy resources. Our final presenter is Tim Rowan, the Director of Regulatory Strategy at National Grid. Tim will present the perspective of a distribution company in the market environment created from Order 2222. After their remarks, we'll open up to audience Q&A. You can ask questions via the question chat box at any time, and we'll read those out for the presenters when we get to the Q&A session at the end. Now I'll turn it over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Mark. Thank you for having me. Mike Berlinski, Customized Energy Solutions. So I'll give an overview of the Voltron order. That comes from a FERC podcast in which Chair Chatterjee likened the order to the cartoon superhero Voltron, which was an aggregation of distributed resources. So I also grew up in the 1980s with this, so I got a kick out of it. So today I'll be going over some of the background and what the order says. I'll point out what it doesn't say, and then I'll have some points of what to watch out for. Given the limited time, I'm not going to go into what the order means so much, but I think the other speakers will do that, and I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A session. So a little bit about my company, Customized Energy Solutions, so you know where I come from. CES is a consulting firm. We've been around for over 20 years, and we help clients understand and participate in the wholesale and retail electricity and natural gas markets in the US and around the world. I'm in the Emerging Technologies group. You can see the list of groups on the right, where we have focused on energy storage markets. We are happy to partner with ESA on our Storage IQ market intelligence service and offer a discount to ESA members. You can see CES has a number of other groups, like the Wholesale group that schedules resources into all the ISO markets, and the Market IQ group that covers every ISO stakeholder meeting. So that provides us with unparalleled market intelligence and operating experience, including and especially around energy storage. And we're proud to support ESA on wholesale market policy which has included FERC orders 841 and 2222. So now a little bit of background, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but it's important to remember that this order only applies to FERC jurisdictional ISOs and RTOs, and that's independent system operators or regional transmission organizations. And for our purposes here, they're the same thing, and I'm just going to use a shorthand of ISO for ISO markets. So these ISOs cover most of the US. You can see the map on the right. And the market products of interest are capacity, energy, and ancillary services. And you can see a simple list on the left. Now, for more background, I would encourage you to check out ESA's webinar on ISO and RTO markets as part of their Storage 101 series. So now a little bit about the order and what it says. This was issued last month. It directs ISOs to remove barriers to the participation of distributed energy resource aggregations in ISO markets. It does define a DER, aggregator, ISO markets. It does identify some existing barriers that justify the need for such an order. They include a minimum size to participate, that's too high, a lack of existing and appropriate participation models. The existing ones have not been sufficient. They've limited operations and services to be provided. It identifies some of the benefits, including helping ISOs with visibility of these resources, alleviate congestion around the grid, lower energy costs to consumers, and enhance reliability. Some of the other benefits I think will accrue to market participants include clarity of rules, specificity in rules in the ISO tariffs. It should open new opportunities. Now, in terms of what the ISOs are told to do, they have to go establish participation models for DER aggregations that accommodate physical and operational characteristics. So all of this is very similar to FERC's Order 841. And for more information on that order, ESA has provided a number of webinars over the years. Now, ISOs will have to file compliance filings, and it just so happens that this order was published in the Federal Register today, so thank you. The due date has been clarified as being in mid-September 2021, so the clock is ticking. And I definitely encourage interested parties to participate in the ISO stakeholder processes and then comment at FERC. Implementation is left open-ended, and ISOs can propose a reasonable date. So I've included here some of the history of this order. I won't go into the detail, but I think it is helpful just to be aware of it. So now a couple slides on what the order says. I'm not going to read all of these items, but these are taken right out of the order. And it's important to know that there's about 10 different pieces as listed in the order. But I am happy to discuss this during the Q&A session. Some of the other interesting things that I do want to spend a minute to talk about include that FERC said right up front, it has the jurisdiction to do this. It does reference the recent DC Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that upheld FERC jurisdiction around distributed storage resources and Order 841. And that is significant. Now there is a complaint at FERC around some of these issues, and that is important to see how that will play out. Of relevant to that is FERC said in this order 2222, there is no state opt-out, and that has been a contentious issue around 841. It does provide an opt-in for small utilities, and that's similar to an opt-in per Order 719 around demand response. Now, FERC says in this order that a demand response or DR resource can be a DER, but it also says that this order, it does not affect existing DR rules in all the ISO markets. So I think that's similar to what FERC said in Order 841. is that that was focused on electric storage resources, and they said then also that it was not going to affect existing DR rules. Also, FERC did clarify that an aggregation can contain just a single resource. And interestingly, it says the ISOs have to allow for heterogeneous aggregations or aggregations of different types of resources. So this could be resources with different technologies, maybe renewable and storage, resources that are dispatchable and non-dispatchable, maybe some that are net injecting onto the grid or not. Also a combination of behind the customer meter and in front of meters. So that's really interesting to see how that's handled, given that there were a lot of comments and concerns expressed by the ISOs around that during the stakeholder process. So now some things that the order does not say. It's not overly prescriptive. It really gives a lot of flexibility left to the ISOs. So this is definitely significant, again, given that ISOs had a lot of concerns and were pushing back against the proposals during the proceeding. Interconnection, FERC explicitly said that they declined to exercise jurisdiction over the interconnection of DERs connected to distribution facilities. FERC also did not require standard interconnection process. So that's something that may remain a challenge if there are major delays or costs to the interconnection of resources. FERC did not take up any topics that were deemed beyond the scope of the NOPR. One important example would be capacity market mitigation policies. And there were folks on both sides of this, some concerned that there should be detailed mitigation policies to protect the integrity of the markets, and others who were and are afraid of over mitigation of these types of resources, often given that there may be some state subsidies in play. And then one thing that the order doesn't say is that the ISO markets have to provide enough revenue to make these projects make economic sense. And I'll just point out from my consulting experience, each project is different, and one really needs to understand the appropriate value stack. It is often the case that other value streams, in addition to the ISO markets, are needed in order to make the project economics work. And so now lastly, what to watch out for. As I said, much flexibility is left to the individual ISOs. So again, I encourage interested folks to participate in the ISO stakeholder processes and then comment at FERC. How will heterogeneous aggregations be handled, given that an aggregation may contain resources with different characteristics, maybe behind and in front of meters, and maybe historically have been participating under different participation models. And as an optimist, I'm hopeful that this effort may lay some groundwork for hybrid resource market enhancements, given that FERC is looking at this, recently had a technical conference on hybrid resources. Will dual participation, and here I mean wholesale and retail, really be fully enabled? Will there be barriers left in place or making it more difficult to access the market and participate? I wonder how much power will be given to utilities, how high will the requirements or the hurdles be, how will things like interconnection, distribution tariffs be handled? Do the compliance plans strike the right balance between giving utilities a say and avoiding undue barriers to market access and participation? Will maximum capacity requirements be too low? So this order will lower the minimum capacity requirement down to 100 kilowatts. So that should lower a threshold. But what will the maximum requirements be, given that there are generally economies of scale for projects? How broad will locational requirements be for aggregations? Will they be limited to a point of interconnection or node? Will they be as broad as a zone? Will they be as broad as the whole ISO region? And then will information and data requirements be quite onerous? For example, if you're changing resources within an aggregation, how much effort does that require? And then finally, I just want to note that there were 4 requests for rehearing and clarification filed this week. They're mostly around FERC jurisdiction and the opt-in and opt-out provisions. So we'll see how that goes. So FERC will have to respond to those requests, and then it will issue a decision on them. So thanks for that, and I look forward to the Q&A session. And now I'll turn it over to Ted.
Great, thanks a lot, Mike. Again, Ted Coe, I'm the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for STEM, and I oversee all legislative and regulatory work for the company in North America, and also was heavily involved in the development of Order 2222 and the docket at FERC for the last 4 years. So have quite a bit to say about the topic and quite a bit to celebrate actually in the issuance of this order. So a brief description of STEM. We are the largest operator of behind-the-meter energy storage systems networked together as virtual power plants, I think, in the world in terms of megawatts. And so we have a very strong interest in this order and in the market rules that will result from this order. This slide gives us some stats about the company, but the most interesting number on this is probably the grid services line, where we talk about more than 2,400 grid service dispatches, which is to go to show you that the technology for creating virtual power plants, aggregations or virtual power plants of energy storage is here. It's been operating, it's commercial, and there are companies like STEM that have been out there doing this and responding to market dispatches for a few years now. So in looking at the landscape of, in looking at the landscape of distributed energy storage, either front of the meter or behind the meter, it's useful to segment the market into the table that I have here on this slide. So if you look at it across the top, is either front of the meter energy storage systems, behind the meter exporting systems, which means systems that actually put energy onto the grid from behind the customer meter, and then behind the meter non-exporting systems, which in many cases, or look to most markets and most grids, look like demand response resources. And then you further divide the segment into single site versus aggregated. So if you look at single individual sites of energy storage versus aggregated sites, and then within those, in each of those market segments, you think about a standalone energy storage system that's just an asset by itself, a resource by itself, versus what we call hybrid systems, which usually is pairing with a generator, a storage pair with a generator like solar. And so looking at this landscape, the Order 2222 really covers the orange colored boxes there around aggregations of either front of the meter or behind the meter exporting storage systems, either standalone or hybrid. Aggregations of behind the meter non-exporting type systems really mostly participate today already under existing demand response models, both individually as a demand response asset for the customer site, or as an aggregated demand response resource into the markets. I'm not going to go through all these bullets or text here, but I would say, like, to call out that under Order 2222, you have like bullet number 4 here is that some of the ISO markets already do have models for aggregations and ways in which these resources can participate as an aggregation in their markets, but the requirements of Order 2222 will actually make them need to improve those models to be in full compliance. And so we can talk about some degrees of like what aspects of their current models need to be improved or changed. The thing in number 5, which is interesting, is that front of the meter projects, even though Order 2222 covers front of the meter projects, typically a lot of the front of the meter projects, especially in the storage space, for up to date, have been large enough to participate in the markets by themselves. And so if you're over, in most markets, if you're over 1 megawatt in size already, then you could bid into those markets as your own resource, and you don't have to aggregate with anybody else. And so those systems have mostly been are mostly affected by Order 841, but it's possible that if there's future applications of smaller front-of-the-meter energy storage systems, then it would make sense to use Order 2222 to aggregate to participate in the markets. And then bullet number 6 there, I just wanted to mention also that the behind-the-meter non-exporting systems are typically going to be demand response type resources, but in this case, because the order allows aggregations of heterogeneous aggregations, like Mike was mentioning, you could start mixing in these behind-the-meter resources with front-of-the-meter resources or behind-the-meter exporting resources, and end up creating aggregation that way. So if you look at what Order 2222 does is talking about the flexibility. What's going to happen with this is going to talk about the flexibility that that Mike was mentioning. And the flexibility can broadly be characterized as, will the ISOs and utilities really implement this according to the spirit of the order, which is really to try to get the most participation of DERs in the wholesale markets that you can, or really just go with the letter of the order and like what exactly the minimum they have to do to comply with the order. And so in these topic areas I'm listing here, you kind of have, these are the kind of dimensions of the topic areas in which you can see like a difference in the approach. So the first one is wholesale, retail, multi-use. Again, Mike mentioned that also. Zone participation is like, you can either write the rules to encourage as much of this as possible, or you can write the rules to discourage this as much as possible. Also with interconnection, can it be a fast, relatively straightforward, relatively cost-effective interconnection process and study procedures, or what can it be? It can be made to be extremely slow and implemented very, a long time from now, with a lot of dispatch override issues and things like that. So again, these are going to really affect, how the markets develop, depending on where along the spectrum the implementers choose to go. The third one is abstraction. What I call abstraction is like, do you treat this aggregation or this VPP as a single resource in all ways, or do you write rules that force people to go inside and look at the individual components inside the resource, and that's just going to cause more overhead, more time, more friction in the process if you have to actually be opening up the box every time when you're bidding or participating or settling wholesale market transactions. And then the last one is practical barriers. There are things that are like where you can be compliant according to the rules, but in practical implementation from a developer's or aggregator's point of view are going to be just barriers to participation, even though the rules are ostensibly compliant. One of those big ones is the one we see in the Cal ISO, which is the 24/7 market participation for DERs. So if technically you're allowed to, their NGR or DIRT model allows you to aggregate those resources into the wholesale market, but they require those resources to be in the market 24/7, which essentially kind of kills multi-use. And then so the practical barrier, it ends up being not a viable path to participation. So that's just one example of the kinds of practical barriers that can be still put up under this order. So the timing of this is 1 year to file tariff changes, and the order only gave them a reasonable time to implement. So depending on how they go down these paths will greatly affect when those markets actually open up and become viable for participation by DER aggregations. And then my last slide here is really just about the potential for Order 2222 is, again, based on where they come down on that flexibility in implementation. And each one of those things really affect the economics of your virtual power plants. And then that, of course, affects your market opportunity, your ultimate market opportunity. And so, in the wholesale retail multi-use, we want to make sure that, they give us the full revenue as we can, prove is incremental to any kind of multi-use situation. We want to make sure the interconnection process is fast and, minimize costs and risks. And then on the abstraction, we want to make sure that you minimize overhead, right? So as much as possible, don't go look inside the aggregation. And if you can do that, if you can avoid looking inside the aggregation, then the overhead will be minimized, and then these resources can be much more efficient. And then the practical barriers. Again, the question is, do you just comply with the order, or do you actually go look at the actual practical barriers in your markets and proactively work with the state regulators and distribution utilities to actually remove those barriers? So the ultimate potential, I would say, is essentially all the load under FERC jurisdictional ISOs. So if you look at Mike's original slide, it was like 2/3 of the load is under ISO RTOs. And if you take out ERCOT, which is not under FERC jurisdiction, you end up with about 50 to 60% of the load in the U.S. is affected by this order. If you take out the small utilities that were given an opt-out type provision, then you're thinking about 50%. So about 50% of the load is covered by this order, and the potential of this order is that we can deploy DERs to all of that load and make that all those megawatts available as active market participants in the wholesale markets. And so that's the ultimate I guess goal of this whole effort, and it represents a tremendous opportunity for DERs and DER aggregators and customers, frankly, to become part of the wholesale markets for energy in the United States. And that's it for me, and I will then hand it off to Tim.
Great, thanks, Ted. Tim Rowan with National Grid. I've been fortunate to be involved in issues around demand response with the company for 20 years or so. The old interruptible rates distribution utilities had, and then going to price and emergency demand response programs that the ISOs had when they first were formed, and then working our way through the various orders, the capacity markets, and all the rest of it. So a lot of work here. I'm primarily in the distribution company arena for National Grid. You can see on the slide here, we serve about half the state of Mass, most of Rhode Island, and about half the physical space of New York, probably a little more, but obviously not half the load in New York. I think our peak load in New York about 6 gigawatts, of 4.5 in Mass, and about 1.6 or so in Rhode Island. And that's the figure where the company is. I want to start with the conversation relative to what the company's already been doing for these sorts of DERs. For some reason, I can't seem to move the slide here. I apologize. Not sure what's. Here we go. So the company has been extraordinarily active in terms of distributing resources right along here. 35 plus years of award-winning energy efficiency. Kilowatt hour not used is the cheapest one customers can purchase, if you will. And then obviously working through targeted demand response in the early 2000s, initial work on non-wires alternatives in terms of using the capacity from DERs, mostly distributed generation, to manage load on the electric distribution system. So the fact of the matter is, this is right up the company's alley, and we've recently announced a net zero goal, and 3 of the many components are, reducing the load through energy efficiency, demand response, utilizing more storage, and enable and optimize DG. One of our big programs going forward is we're trying to get away from simply interconnecting DG or DER, but being able to integrate that into the systems as best we can. And you can see we've got quite a bit installed in our footprint here, about 2,400 megawatts already. That's approximately 1,600 in Mass, 600 or so in New York, and approximately a couple of 300 in Rhode Island. And you can see that we're starting to get a significant amount of storage that's already connected, the bulk of that being in Massachusetts, because that's where the incentives for storage currently exist, but there's a lot of pending applications for that as well. And as Ted mentioned, these hybrid of solar storage, and Mike as well, are becoming more and more prevalent to get in the markets. But also folks want a clean backup power source. You know, solar with batteries, as long as you're going to sunny the next day, really work well for long-term power outages. So going to the next slide, the company's been doing a significant amount of work here, you know, due to the state policies and all, in all three jurisdictions we have. There's a significant amount of DER and DG, mostly solar, and due to the state policies, they promote you know, solar farms, you know, as small as 2 megawatts in New York, but as big as 10 megawatts a piece in Rhode Island. And those are connected to the local distribution system. And what you end up with is you get significantly high saturation. You know, if you do the math of watts of solar per square mile, you know, the state of Massachusetts with the 3 megawatts total in the state of Mass, it has more watts per square mile of solar than many other states. Even though many states have lots more solar, Massachusetts is a much smaller state. And what happens is the local distribution system simply runs out of capacity. And so the distribution companies have to request new capacity from the transmission provider, and they result in upgrades and substations and all the rest. You can see the kind of numbers we're talking about. Plus, we're talking about changing our distribution voltages in some areas from a 15 kV class system to a 35 kV class system, simply to accommodate more of the renewables that all our states are really pushing for. Between, you know, Massachusetts net zero goals, 100% renewable goal in Rhode Island, et cetera, it's something we're working hand in hand with those states. Also, significant amount of work over quite a bit of time with the NYSO and the other joint distribution utilities in New York. So that's been working on for quite some time. There'll be significant work there. One of the challenges that we're still grappling with as part of some of those proposed rules is that we have to make sure that when there's an ISO or a system operator dispatches storage, there'll be no negative impact on any other customer. You know, we do studies for interconnection primarily to make sure that once the resource is online and operating, it won't affect any of the neighbors. And because we're talking about distribution circuits that can have anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 customers on those circuits, it's a very important piece of work the company works through to assure all customers are properly, are properly addressed. So at the end of the day, the company's been working very closely with a lot of parties to move forward, but we obviously know there's lots of work ahead. And the next couple slides will kind of talk through some of the challenges that we see in the wholesale retail interface here. Oh, there, oops, it keeps, all of a sudden it goes. There we go. You know, in the past, from the distribution utility perspective, we really didn't have any need, frankly, to deal with the system operators and the ISOs, if you will, because essentially they were coordinating with the transmission providers, and then our transmission providers were typically the ones dealing in the ISO working groups and whatnot. So pulling in the distribution utilities is going to be very important, but it is something that's a bit different for many of us because it's not a place that we've had to interact with. And some of us, myself included, have worked on other FERC issues in the past. The original small generator interconnection procedures from 2003 and 4, the creation of the forward capacity market in ISO New England in the mid 2000s. So that's what's going to have to work. So now as we go into other work here, we'll need to make sure that what a proposed entity wants to participate in, how they'll interact typically with a distribution company in some fashion. Again, if they're connected to distribution, which I think obviously a lot of this is about here. But currently, there's a whole lot of required telemetry, real-time visibility to the operation centers that we've got to understand better. Will they still need that, essentially, and it is real-time visibility. You are required for certain markets to have real-time telemetry back to the system operator so that the system operator can dispatch you. And typically with renewables, if there was an issue, they would obviously ask you to curtail some, if all, not all of your output. So again, that's going to have to be sorted out. How much do we still need with that? And wanting to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. The challenge about the jurisdiction over interconnection, even though the FERC has indicated they're not going to, go down that path, it still is important because there are existing rules around when a project is required to go through the FERC process and/or interconnect directly through the ISO, and other projects that don't have to do that and would simply be managed under the state interconnection procedures. The old rule of the small gen rules and the large gen rules were primarily put in place to make sure project developers had a third-party independent entity to manage interconnection, because back in the day, some utilities may or may not have been working as quickly as they could have been on interconnection. But frankly, for the states we do business in, Rhode Island, Mass, and New York, the regulators are extraordinarily attentive to the interconnection process in all three states. And in point of fact, there's various actual penalties for utilities, distribution utilities in two of the states, Rhode Island and Mass. Well, I'm sorry, all three, frankly. And so the need for an independent entity to manage interconnection, at least in our part of the country, is pretty much moot now. To be clear, it wasn't moot 20 years ago, but today I think it is. I think one of the key problems that we'll want to be looking through, or challenges, is as we move forward with what these entities will do and the aggregations that will be included, and we can envision, frankly, in some cases, tens or hundreds of participants in an aggregation, then we have to make sure that whatever the distribution company is doing won't cause, and I use the term unfunded mandate. In other words, are there requirements that the ISO will have where the distribution utility either can't currently do that, or can't completely meet the need, and that would force the distribution utility then to spend more money without their state regulatory body approving that, because that's a complete non-starter, right? At the end of the day, we have to be very clear that our state regulators, the Mass Department of Public Utilities, the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission, and New York State Public Service Commission have and retain that regulatory authority, as they should, for their in-state distribution utilities. So that be a fine line we'll all have to walk in terms of the rules and requirements, and we'll be able to move that forward. In our opinion, it comes out of the old New York Rev orders, if you recall that name. It seems to have lost a little bit of its allure, but the reality is the underlying challenges that was trying to address are still out there. And one of the key issues is when and how do we actually get into a distribution system operator model that will coordinate with the ISO operators and manage the load down at the distribution level. So it's another level of managing the market at that level, and obviously will require significant expansion of a lot of very active grid modernization activities that are already occurring, but we'll need to understand from that work and potentially advanced metering work how the monitoring, metering, transfer of data, settlement of various markets, all those things are going to interact in as streamlined a way as possible. But again, with that, I did want to make sure we got to the questions. So I'm going to give it back to Mark.
Thanks so much, Tim. That was really excellent. You can, for the attendees, feel free to submit your questions through the chat box in the browser. We already have quite a few, and I will begin to ask those, but you can continue to send some questions in, and I think we'll have time to answer them. I'll stick with Tim here. There's a question that just came in. Can you elaborate on challenges for energy storage system calls by the ISOs on DISCO customers, and have you seen any in current operation?
Well, our challenge at this point is we don't have visibility to which one of the customers are actually participating in the markets. It's confidential information. So if an entity is participating in some market somewhere, unless they volunteer that to the company, we're just not aware they're there. And there's no obligation for them to tell us. And frankly, no obligation for the ISO to notify us. So in what I'm expecting or hoping through this work we'll do on 2322 is to make sure that we have that same visibility that we currently don't have. Because again, there's been so little storage installed that even if there was some sort of, dispatch that wasn't quite right, it would likely not cause any big challenges on the system at this small level. But where we've seen massive saturation of distributed generation, and frankly, we're expecting the same thing with storage and hybrid resources, we will need to make sure we have that visibility.
Okay, thanks. Here's one that came in during Mike's presentation. The question is, what does, quote, decline to exercise jurisdiction over interconnection, unquote, of DER distribution facilities mean? Does it actually cede authority to state regulators or leave it in no man's land?
Yeah, thanks for that. Good question. So I think FERC is not giving up any jurisdiction. FERC certainly could have commented more over that, but they were saying that they continue not to have jurisdiction over state jurisdictional interconnection. And there are rules, they may vary by state or by ISO region, as to whether an interconnection application should be state jurisdictional and really be focused on the distribution utility, or FERC jurisdictional and really focus on the transmission owner. Tim can probably talk more about that distinction, but no, I don't think FERC is ceding any ground. They really didn't want to get into interconnection issues in this order.
Okay, thanks. That's really good. I think I'm gonna stay with you, Mike. It's an interesting question. Why did this aggregation topic require its own order as opposed to being included as part of FERC Order 841? I think I'll pose that to any of the panelists and start with you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for that. Good question. And that goes a little bit to the history. And while these issues did start in the same docket with what became Order 841, there was some stakeholder preference expressed, and ultimately the commission agreed that the issues around DER aggregations are different enough that it was broken out. And part of it is it was appropriate to and FERC preferred to focus on the in some way plain vanilla storage issues, just to get a participation model for the sort of standalone electric storage resources.
Okay, Ted, do you have any insight into that?
I agree with Mike in the sense that, I mean, simply also is like the DER order 2222 was for all DERs and not just storage. So that was a simple distinction to make. But yes, I mean, the issues around aggregations and how you work with aggregations are potentially a lot more complicated and difficult to work through than were the kind of vanilla energy storage type rules. Also, the jurisdiction question around DERs and opt-outs was originally thought to be mostly an DER aggregation issue, but it ended up coming up in Order 841 anyway. So it was useful to separate, at the time it was useful to separate those out, but it ended up not being, it ended up being an issue in the storage order anyway.
All right, thanks. Sticking with Ted here, are you defining DER as customer-sided solar and storage, or are you also including generators?
No, DERs are, as the order describes, are any of these kinds of resources, right? It doesn't have to be customer-sided. Could be front of the meter, like when I, in my chart, I had included front of the meter, which could be on the distribution system, anywhere in the distribution system. But they could be customer-sided front of the meter. They could be customer-sided behind the meter, or they could be just on the distribution system. So it's any of those kinds of locations, as well as any of those types of resources. It could be a generator, it could be a storage, could be load control, demand response, any of those kinds of resources.
Okay, here's a question for Tim. What has been the experience of and lessons learned by National Grid in Massachusetts with the battery storage systems that have come online through the Massachusetts SMART program?
Our experience has been good. I think the challenge the developers of storage have had is that in order for us to study a project, it's someone brings in straight solar. It's a pretty straightforward analysis, because the solar curve is going to be the solar curve, and that's all there is to it. When you have storage, then now you need to ask the storage owner for how they expect to operate that system. And because the rules are still being written and the markets are just still nascent, many of them really don't know long-term what they plan to do with the storage. And that's challenging from an interconnection analysis perspective, because then we have no choice but to look at the conservative nature. In other words, we have to assume they'll be in the frequency reg market and charging and discharging rapidly. And for a multi-megawatt storage facility, that can be a real challenge on some of our longer distribution circuits and will cause flicker. So if we have to study that as the analysis, we'll study it and we'll provide the upgrades required to make sure that won't affect the neighbors. But you'll likely have to pay for a lot more than you need if you're never going to do that. If it's a simple, I want to move my peak of storage from 1:30 in the afternoon to 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, that's a much simpler analysis for us to do. But our challenge, and what we've recently just filed some consensus language because we're working on the interconnection tariff and storage as we speak, we filed some consensus language that talks to this exact issue and what we as utilities would need to do the studies quickly, efficiently, versus their desire. And frankly, from the storage community, things are changing very quickly. So to a valid point, they don't want to be stuck with a certain requirement, then have to come back to the utility, say, oh, by the way, we want to do this now. So it is an interesting process that we're working our way through. And for example, there'll be different options now that folks can propose, and we'll study the different options, and then the customer can select the one they want. But yeah, so there's been challenge only because if everyone knew exactly what they wanted to do, it'd be easy. But it's just too early in this market for to expect any developer to know what I'm going to do for the next 20 years.
All right.
This is Ted. I would add on to that in the sense that, like, as a developer that's developed projects in the SMART program in Massachusetts and working on this, is the relevant rules in terms of the wholesale markets is really more around the hybrid resources type rules that are just being talked about now. And FERC had a technical conference in July about hybrid resources, and there's initiatives around the country around hybrid resources. So it's a little bit more in that realm than in the Order 2222 realm, because again, these systems are not going to be typically aggregated. They'll typically directly participate by themselves as a single resource. But like a lot of these kinds of issues, the experience about these has been the challenges with the rules not being set or the participation models not being set for hybrid resources. And it's something that, like, we would like a Order 841, Order 2222 style order to come out for hybrids, as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to address this one to Mike, but Ted and Tim, you might want to chime in after Mike has had a crack at it. This is a kind of a general question, but a very interesting one. Do you think that the cooperation framework outlined in the order will help to enhance the development of harmonized market opportunities at both wholesale and retail levels and reduce litigation?
Wow, that's a good question. My short answer, again, as an optimist, is yes. But I think Ted and Tim can definitely provide more color around that.
You're obviously not an attorney, because reducing litigation is not necessarily the optimistic point of view there. Go ahead, Tim.
I would say, and so having extensively commented on this topic, actually in the proceeding, I'm less optimistic in the sense that the order didn't provide as much guidance as I would have hoped it would provide in order to help ISOs develop those coordination frameworks with their with the distribution utilities. I think it would have been, they left it pretty wide open, and it would have been more helpful to have some kind of guideposts and kind of a high level structure to say, like, these are the kinds of ways in which a coordination framework should evolve. And so you're going to have, it's going to take a lot to figure out how to do that coordination. And there's only places like New York ISO is the only one that I know, and the DPS there in New York is the only one that actually made significant progress on this, I think. But there's definitely going to be some like litigation around things like the utility override of a wholesale market dispatch, which is something that I feel was a pretty big error in this order. But the fact that it's there is going to be a pretty serious bone of contention in developing coordination. That's just one example of the many coordination points you're going to need to develop. But that's one that I think could be pretty contentious.
Yeah, Ted, thanks for that. That's exactly the issue in New York, right? The fact of the matter is, we also have the need to continue our non-wires alternative work because that's public policy as well. So we have that need and desire to reduce spending at the distribution level. And fundamentally, when you have a dual use of participant in a retail non-wires program who's getting paid to deliver capacity, and there's a conflict when that same resource is supposed to do something for the ISO for the wholesale market. The reason we're paying them for the non-wires is to prevent a distribution level event causing at the end game and outage to customers. As I said, these distribution circuits serve anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 customers each. So for us, that's a huge issue in terms of making sure that as long as these are working together, we're fine. But but again, which market rules is really going to be something we've got to get sorted out, because the alternative is we will have to overbuild the distribution system so that can happen routinely without anyone having to worry about it, and that's completely counter to state policy to try to reduce capital spending at the distribution level. So that's an excellent place where we'll have lots of conversations around.
Yeah, fair enough. There's another question that I think is a good barometer for optimists or pessimists. I'm gonna, I'll rephrase it and just do the end. Is this order more of a quote promise unquote, or will there be actual reliable contracted revenue streams created as the ISOs comply?
Yeah, this is Mike. I'll take a first cut. Is that understanding ISO markets, they're generally not subject to long-term contracted and fixed and known rates or prices. They're generally considered merchant and variable, subject to market forces. So they are quite different from some of the other programs, incentives, and value streams that folks may be familiar with. So that's important on the value side. I will say, though, that again, as an optimist, this order should be more than a promise, and it does give direction, and ISOs should make changes and new opportunities should be created. So I'll pause there. See if the others want to add.
Yeah, I would say, again, on the optimist side, and then you go back to my slides, right? It's like there's the spectrum of how much this is going to be, how much value it's going to produce, or how much potential value there is, an opportunity there is really on, you know, where the implementation comes down on the spectrum of, you know, spirit of the order versus letter of the order. And I think, and again, if I want to be being a little bit of an optimist, is like that we can work through this with by participating in the ISO implementation, you know, stakeholder processes to get it to be the most, you know, the highest potential out of this order, and to kind of the design decisions to be made for those better outcomes. I think it will result in real significant increase in the opportunity for DERs to earn revenue.
Yeah, and this is Tim. I completely agree with both Mike and Ted. The opportunities are going to be there. But to Mike's point, for example, of capacity markets in New England, you know, just a few short years ago, there were $9, $10 a kilowatt month you could get paid for providing capacity. But it's cyclical. When there's you know, a dearth of capacity, the prices go up significantly. When there's oversupply, like now, the prices drop to $1 or $2 a kilowatt month. So I think the volatility of those markets is real. And to Mike's point, it is a merchant play, but understanding it's cyclical, you know, as long as you understand there'll be good years and bad years, but over the term of your project, you know, it should pencil out. I think that's going to be the challenge folks are going to be have to think through and get their arms around in order to move projects forward in an aggressive way. But I'm very confident the industry will be able to do that. They've been able to do lots of cool things over the course of my 20 years in this side of the house. So.
Yeah, great. Okay, got time for a question or two. I wanted to ask Ted, although I know you have a you've written on this, but could you tell us what you think this order might imply for resilience? You know, I know that in California, for example, there was some, you know, during the recent blackouts, brownouts, and whatnot, there was some behind the meter storage sort of left on the table. Could you discuss the resilience angle of this a little bit?
Sorry, Mark, this is for me. This is Ted.
Oh, yes, yes, Ted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I think the key thing about this is that from a resilience point of view, and the value of resilience from DER resources, especially like storage and solar and storage together in a kind of microgrid or backup scenario, is going to be much more enabled by the just deployment of DERs that can take advantage of the wholesale markets. So meaning that, like, up to now, the value of the compensation you could get for resilience in a lot of cases was not sufficient for deploying these resources. But if you can, again, value stack, and that's why it's really important to do multi-use, the dual retail wholesale participation, that if you get those right, and that these resources can value stack again to the full value of what they're providing to the system, then that could be enough, that hopefully will be enough to deploy large amounts of DERs that can provide resilience. So by essentially opening up a revenue stream to these resources that wasn't there before, it's going to enable the deployment of these resources at a large scale that can also provide resilience to the local grid. And so yes, it's definitely going to be helpful. As when these markets open up, it'll definitely be helpful in states and local grids becoming more resilient.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We've come to the top of the hour, and I'd like to thank the presenters for a very informative session. Before we conclude, I'd like to remind you about our in-depth seminar on planning for energy storage on December 2nd and 3rd. And please submit any suggestions for future webinar topics to events@energystorage.org. Best wishes for the rest of your day, and hoping that you all stay safe and healthy.